Listening to Myself, or How Audiobooks Became a Part of Life. Read by the voice of David Erdody. Introduction. I first became interested in recording what could be called audiobooks in the summer of 1982, just before my first year of college at Eastern Michigan University, EMU. In thinking about how I was going to succeed academically in college following a mediocre K-12 performance and wanting to become a physician, my summer thoughts conjured up a strategy that I thought might be effective, if I voice recorded my textbooks. While growing up, I was particularly adept at remembering things I had seen and heard through watching television and listening to the radio. While in junior high, my school held a multi-week school-wide Jeopardy tournament, and I discovered, to everyone's surprise, including myself, that I was the school's Ken Jennings, and I never read books. Even through my high school years, being able to retain very specific details about current and historical events and notable people from all walks of life by watching mostly public television and the news and listening to sports on the radio was considered by many who knew me to border on the unusual. With this ability, I figured that access to recorded academic materials, particularly materials I would record myself, would be to my advantage and lead to certain entry into and graduation from medical school. Basically, it would force me to actually read the assigned material, and then I could listen to it. When I first sat down in my dorm room that initial fall semester and started recording from my biology and history textbooks, it felt awkward, and even worse was listening to how I sounded. After several evenings of this, I gave up on this strategy and focused on studying the old-fashioned way with lecture notes and silent reading throughout the rest of my continued academic career of mediocrity. I have often lamented on why I did not try harder at this, because in retrospect I think it really would have worked for me. And very ironically, I still remember some of the things I read at that time. For example, actin and myosin, of which I kept mispronouncing actin. Despite my giving up on that particular self-formulated strategy, I continued to develop my thinking regarding educational media, and began to question why videotaped course materials were not used in any serious way alongside textbooks and lectures as primary materials in college. What eventually came to mind, and what I was to present in my speech class the next fall, was the idea of the now-termed flipped classroom, where students access the fundamental course materials on video on their own time and spend the scheduled classroom time with the professor discussing and expanding on the material. Convinced that this was a better idea than self-made audio recordings, I took it upon myself to meet with EMU's provost on this matter, and it seemed he took sincere interest in this, although ultimately it never amounted to anything further. What I suppose I really got out of this was taking the initiative to meet with someone of importance in pursuit of my own view of how things should be. Sometime during all this, I led the team that easily won the 1984 EMU Trivial Pursuit Tournament. Winning question: who was the first person to be awarded 2 Nobel Prizes? I was the only one who knew, thanks to Jacob Bronowski. After graduating with a degree in biology, I began working as a laboratory manager for an oncologist at the University of Michigan, UM, and in this position I learned a lot about the biology of cancer and had my first exposure to a Macintosh computer. From this, the idea of using animation to describe the structure and function of DNA suddenly interested me a great deal. After contacting several UM department chairs, whose curricula involved the teaching of DNA, to inquire if and how DNA was taught using animated video, instead of static pictures in textbooks and overheads, I was told that it was not used. The only video materials in the UM library that taught the structure and function of DNA were on 16mm film. One film I came across was a 1971 production of a dance ensemble's choreographed interpretation of DNA replication and protein synthesis, accompanied by a rock band, and that looked like everyone was on LSD. After learning how to do chemical modeling and simple animations on the Mac, I pursued starting a business with a college friend that would produce and market an educational videotape to sell to schools and libraries that utilized 3D animation to teach the fundamentals of DNA. I wrote a script and storyboard that we took around to different Detroit-based ad agencies to get their quote on what something like this would cost. Back then, ad agencies were the go-to for professional animation production. My simple Mac-based animations would not have cut it, but it did point the way. This was 1990, and our plan for a professionally produced video that could have easily taught anyone about how the fundamental nature of life worked at the molecular level to be used in high school and college science curricula was going to be very expensive to produce, and so this cost-prohibitive idea eventually expired. If you now search YouTube for DNA animation, you get millions of results. But again, formulating and planning this kind of idea and setting out to pursue the goal I had in mind, and taking it upon myself to interact with experts in various fields, was very satisfying and liberating. It was my own thing. I just needed to keep searching for the right medium and message. In 1993, while working in the UM's Department of Human Genetics and having given up on the idea of medical school, I decided to enroll in EMU's graduate school in educational technology. The internet was starting to make its way into everyone's lives, and so it was an opportune time to take a leave of absence from the UM to change my career from medical science to learning how the internet was influencing education. In moving back home with my parents while enrolled full-time, I read through my father's issues of the New Yorker magazine and noticed that each issue always contained ads for the Books on Tape, BOT, and recorded books companies. Although having never listened to an actual audiobook up to then, it was clear what these were all about, and I began to think about audio reading again. The audiobook in full. Getting out of class one cold and rainy evening and with a flu bug starting to take hold, I stopped into Borders Books, corporate store #1 in downtown Ann Arbor, and looked through their small audiobook section. I picked out the abridged recording of John Grisham's The Pelican Brief read by Anthony Heald and listened to it on my drive home. I loved it. It made the dreary 45-minute drive so much better as I was enthralled by Mr. Heald's narration and didn't care how. During this idyllic time of reading and writing, BOT announced the upcoming availability of the first of what would be the 11 volumes of Will and Ariel Durant's Epic Story of Civilization series, and to be entirely read by Alexander Adams. This to me was the culmination of how good the audiobook format could really be. This massive work of narrative history was now going to be wholly accessible to me. I even wrote a letter to the CEO of BOT, Duval Hecht, and told him of my great excitement that the Durant series was being planned and that BOT's best reader was given this significant project. Mr. Hecht promptly wrote back to express his appreciation in my delight. I immediately rented that first volume of the series titled Our Oriental Heritage when it became available, and my father, who had recently had eye surgery due to diabetic retinopathy, appreciated listening to it as he was familiar with Durant from his school days and said to me, "That reader is really good." Also during this time, my father and I would regularly watch C-SPAN's Book Notes program together, and we were always impressed by the show's host, C-SPAN's founder and CEO Brian Lamb, and the simple yet effective way he interviewed authors about their nonfiction books and the overall enjoyment of books. Suddenly, a very formidable idea began to crystallize. Screw it, I'm going to do this myself. It was now 1995, and a new company called Real Networks made it possible to provide on-demand, lengthy audio content over the internet through streaming, and from this, a sudden simplicity appeared to me. 3 things had converged in my life to make me see the light. 1. Audiobooks. 2. My father's diabetic retinopathy. 3. Learning about computer accessibility through my grad school work. In particular, how people who are completely blind use special text-to-voice navigation software, are able to fully navigate the internet, and use real audio. Although my father was not legally blind and never became so, he passed away in 1998, the very real possibility of sudden and significant vision loss due to his diabetes was something that I and my other family members were all too aware of. Since he was an avid reader of the New Yorker magazine, I looked into whether that publication was available on audio cassette for the blind. The person on the phone at the New Yorker office put me on hold for a few minutes, and then came back and said that he and other staff members knew of no audio recordings of the magazine, so I asked him if he thought if this would be a good thing. Yes, certainly it would. My grandmother would like that, he said. When I got off the phone, I clearly remember saying out loud to myself, "Screw it, I'm going to do this myself." And with that merging trifecta of circumstances stewing in my mind, I was to finally set out on creating something on my very own that seemed very necessary and very doable. Simply put, I would produce audiobooks for the blind via the internet. But how and where to start? This would be all new territory for me. First off, I formed my own 501c3 nonprofit organization, NPO, through the Internal Revenue Service, IRS. whose stated purpose would be to record magazine articles and books for the blind, first on audio cassette and eventually the internet. As an NPO, I would not have to deal with copyright issues due to the then recent passage of the Chafee Amendment, now Sec 121, of the Copyright Act, which allows NPOs fair use to reproduce copyrighted written works into accessible formats, for example audio, to be used exclusively for the blind and reading impaired. I thought that as a nonprofit this was a big advantage as to my freedom of choice in the reading materials I could provide. After getting all the formalities completed, the IRS granted me NPO status, EIN 38, 3319932. I first named the NPO incorporating my parents' names into it and then soon after amended it to the simple and straightforward assistive media, to my parents' relief. During this time, I also began a first phase in learning how to produce audiobooks and to get feedback on what directions to take. I had just moved to Central Ann Arbor, and it was the perfect environment to do something like this. I had no problem at all finding local people who wanted to be narrators in this worthy cause. By posting ads all over town as if I were recruiting members of a new rock band, I ended up auditioning many interesting people, some who became lifelong friends. One person I auditioned was named Meg White, who I did not choose and never saw again. I think her drumming auditions went better. I also began to very seriously practice audiobook narration myself, and found out that this task, while challenging at first, eventually became a very enjoyable activity. Sidebar: how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Narrating is like mastering a musical instrument. It still felt awkward for me at first, but then over time and with that all-important lots of practice that I neglected previously, I could reel off paragraphs at first sight, that is reading cold, both fluidly and effortlessly, the way an accomplished pianist can perform an unfamiliar score. The trick, for me, is to have your eyes just a little bit ahead of what you are speaking, so that when it comes time to speak those words, you are ready to speak them, inflect them, appropriately, confidently. Try it. Lock yourself in a quiet room and speak from any book for an hour. Don't worry about mistakes. Those would normally get edited out. And pay attention to your breathing. Take in full breaths, silently, through your mouth, and try to speak entire sentences in one breath. Get the feel for it and correct yourself when necessary and read on. After an hour you will be exhausted, but if you are not repulsed and could do more, you should seriously consider narrating audiobooks. The secret sauce in running assistive media is that I and others involved get to read interesting books and magazine articles of our own choosing, thanks to NPO copyright clearance freedom, and focus that edifying activity through our voices for the purpose of serving intellectually curious people who, through no real fault of their own, are prevented from reading it. To this day, when I sit at the microphone in my reading studio and immerse myself into verbally interpreting an author's narrative for the purpose mentioned, I cannot think of a more worthwhile activity. In summary, it is time very well spent and costs nothing, and it makes for a disciplining process. You have to speak clearly and smoothly, and your pronunciations must always be correct. Especially tricky are homegrown pronunciations like Cairo, Illinois, and Charlotte, Michigan. Whenever in doubt, call their city hall even after hours, and the clerk or answering machine will pronounce the city correctly for you. Names that are familiar might not be pronounced the way one is used to. Andrew Carnegie, born Scottish, pronounced his name as Carnegie, so you should too. Over time it builds your vocabulary, and I have found that this naturally spills over into my daily conversations. Knowing how to correctly pronounce Eyjafjallajökull, a volcano in Iceland, can impress people, especially from Iceland. In the 2 decades of doing assistive media, so much of the knowledge from reading I possess today comes from this win-win charitable activity. It has become such a part of me that I would still read books into a microphone, even if I were to become a multi-billionaire or an innocent on death row, and if the warden allowed it. The same purity of satisfaction would result, maybe. Back to our story. First steps. In 1996, I began a collaboration with the staff at the Washtenaw County Library, which is a regional library for the National Library Service, NLS, for the blind and disabled of the Library of Congress, which began in FDR's New Deal. With the crew of readers I chose from the auditions was soon able to exclusively distribute through our county's blind library patrons about 100 long-form articles on audio cassette that were previously published in the New Yorker magazine. In-depth pieces such as The Gravel Page by John McPhee, Burma by Amitav Ghosh, and Heart of the Delta by Donovan Webster are particularly memorable. Assistive Media also recorded local stories of interest from the Ann Arbor Observer publication to serve our local community. From these first steps, I received feedback from and met with members of the Ann Arbor blind community. Again, this resulted in lasting friendships and my eventual membership into our local Lions Club, where I took an active part in their own grassroots support for the visually impaired. My next efforts were focused on building a web-based service, a website that speaks for itself. I decided that I did not want to provide an online service that was exclusive to people who were blind disabled as stipulated in the Chaffee Amendment. That type of site would need a password-protected access wall for users who would have to verify their disabilities as they do to qualify for the NLS program to receive cassettes. I wanted it to be accessible and for anyone. Basically, for any person who enjoys the audiobook format and for whatever their reason, which is the ultimate goal of accessibility throughout our society. I did not want to have to inquire about a person's disability. Also, I did not want Focus, the reading material on disability issues. This was to be a place where people with disabilities could go and indulge themselves with what everyone else was able to read, and forget about disabilities for a while, and to incorporate what they read into their conversations with their friends and neighbors, and to feel more integrated into society. But a site like this, no matter how altruistic, would necessitate getting copyright permissions due to the open nature of the web. With my reasoning of inclusiveness, I contacted the New Yorker Chief Counsel Eric Raymond, and after spelling out to him what I had previously done on audio cassette, and that what I was intending online as an IRS-authorized NPO would be free of charge to anyone, he sized me up and gave me the green light of fair use, but added that I wait 90 days after an article was published in the magazine before I offered it as an online recording, and offer it only through my website. Deal. We then exchanged letters of cooperation that also included our requiring to provide copyright recognition in various forms and other routine boilerplate, a term with which I was unfamiliar up to then. We had invested so much of our efforts in providing the New Yorker already, and Mr. Raymond could have said no, and that would have been that. But for him to give this experimental service a chance is something I always greatly appreciated. This is how progress plays out. With the New Yorker's participation, other copyright holders also granted similar fair use permissions. Some titles for only set periods of time, etc. Our great advantage was that we were small potatoes and did not wish to make money off this. Had we grown to anything significant, I am sure these types of agreements would have changed. They never had to. After uploading some audio streaming demos and web designs that were critiqued by visually impaired computer geeks at the Pittsburgh Blind Computer User Group. Keep it simple. Black background, white text for low vision users, images not necessary or at least alt-tagged, etc. An enthusiastic "you got it" and sincere thank you was proclaimed by the group for it to go live. In March of 1998, www.assistivemedia.org did go live with about a dozen articles I had digitized from the library cassette productions and now streamed through Real Audio. It was a bold move that some people thought abandoned our original listeners, but in fact, would greatly expand our listenership. It was like Dylan going electric, and a new era of service was a realty. An avid reader all my life, I've used every format available to the blind. Reading by way of assistive media is great. It's like getting an audio magazine anthology but not having to send it back or throw away the tape or CD and clutter the environment. And it's such a friendly way to read, too. Being able to email comments and get answers about them gives the whole process a wonderful family mood. Eileen Soroka, Pittsburgh, PA. Public Spirit. With this unique website up and running, I reached out to other online organizations whose mission was to serve people with visual impairments. With blind web surfers lauding my efforts, I was able to attract the attention of the press and gave my first interviews to the New York Times and NPR's Science Friday. After hearing me on NPR, legendary jazz pianist Bess Bonnier, who normally read The New Yorker by Braille, emailed me and told me of her excitement on hearing about this service, but that she was having trouble setting up her Real Audio application. Finding out that she lived in Grosse Pointe, about an hour away, I drove out and made a technical service house call, and we discussed assistive media over lunch. We were dear friends thereafter. As a 501c3 NPO assistive media, would be able to receive tax-deductible donations, and I set out to solicit financial support from friends and those small grants. I used the money that first came in to upgrade the recording equipment and to hire work-study students from the University of Michigan. Since I lived and worked a block from the UM campus, this arrangement worked wonderfully. The federal and state work-study program allows non-university NPOs to hire students that qualify for financial aid and reimburses the NPO up to 65% of the funds they used for their employment. Through the work-study program, I hired students to work on the all-important editing, proofing, and processing, post-production, of the digital audio to make the readings sound their very best, and I was able to hire a number of quite capable students, many from the School of Music who were already proficient with digital audio editing tools. Through post-production, you can turn a good-sounding reader into a very good-sounding reader. All spoken mistakes and audio artifacts are eliminated, and any reader's timing, cadence, tempo, and even pitch can be fine-tuned to sound perfectly spot-on. Post-production for an audiobook can be very tedious work, and for this I did not want to solicit volunteers, and the work-study program was a key move in my being able to financially compensate for a significant amount of this type of essential hard work in a most cost-effective way. Big time. In early 1999, Real Networks, Inc., the makers of Real Audio and now Real Video, Real Media, sponsored a series of awards that recognized the best in the web's streaming media developers, the streamers. Their flagship Progressive Award recognized the best nonprofit streaming website, and I enthusiastically submitted my nomination for Assistive Media and crossed my fingers. The judges for this award included Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Mark Cuban of thenBroadcast.com. When Assistive Media was chosen as one of 5 finalists for the Progressive Awards, I was very hopeful but had to be realistic compared to the other finalists I saw. One of the other Progressive Award nominees was Peter Gabriel's Witness website, www.witness.org, which used web-based streaming media to serve as an eyewitness to document and expose human rights abuses, such as sweatshops and human trafficking. A great mission led by a world-renowned human rights advocate and BTW, a legendary musician who I loved. But looking at it objectively, and as I thought then and will point out today, Assistive Media provides a direct solution for a very large worldwide problem. The others simply did not. Witness.org and many other NPO websites, as worthwhile and important as they are intermediary solutions. The problem is yet to be solved. With Assistive Media, a person can click on a title, sit back, and through streaming media, instantly listen to what they are physically unable to read. Problem solved. After much anticipation and waiting for the winners to be announced, I went ahead and emailed Real Networks to ask when they would be announcing the winners. They promptly replied and informed me that Assistive Media had won the Progressive Award and that I was invited to San Francisco to accept this award at the Real Networks Conference and Exhibition 99. I could not believe it. My little NPO was chosen over the very great Mr. Gabriel and his very admirable mission, and by some very prominent judges. Had Witness.org been awarded and Mr. Gabriel attended the conference, Real Networks likely would have garnered a considerable amount of really cool publicity for itself. But that did not happen. The award went to Assistive Media instead. Gosh. At the ceremony announcing the award and while receiving my lava lamp Progressive Streamer statue on stage and expressing my thanks to the most people I have ever faced, I was surprised on stage by Elaine Quigley, Real Networks Director of Nonprofit Activism, with an anonymous donation. The donation, it turned out, was from Rob Glazer, the founder and CEO of Real Networks. This reaffirmed my belief about the virtue of the solution-based service that Assistive Media provided over the other nominated NPOs, and that the judges saw that virtue, and Real Networks clearly saw that virtue, and upped their congrats. Also at this conference I met Tom Lalonde, who was then C-SPAN's online manager, and who seemed to be impressed with my knowledge about the BookNotes program, and who would turn into a very supportive Assistive Media board member and lifelong friend. Buzzing from that whole West Coast experience and with those notable judges having recognized my work, I thought that getting serious funding would be no problemo. After contacting the offices of Jeff Bezos and Mark Cuban soon after in the hopes of securing financial support, and with no success, surely some follow-up success would result. A pursuit of happiness. With the Progressive Award donation fresh in hand, my thinking was to use this money to beget more money to produce more audio, ad infinitum, and sought the services of a professional fundraiser who subcontracted through an Ann Arbor-based NPO consultancy. After about a year of not a single incoming penny of success and a number of outstanding invoices billed to assistive media, I began to question things. Finally realizing what was actually happening, I challenged the consultancy that this fundraiser was dishonest. I held firm and simply did not pay for what I eventually documented was work that was never done. The consultancy could not justify the fundraiser's billing and dropped the outstanding balance on the invoices and cut ties with that fundraiser and dismissed one of its in-house staff members, and yes, I cut ties with the consultancy. All in all, it was for me an administratively circuitous, back to square one, dead-end, lesson learned, buzzkill. Although not having lost any money, I went away from that sobering experience rather blindsided, realizing that there were people out there who actually had no problem in wanting to steal from the blind. And still no positive reply from Messrs. Bezos and Cuban. F*******. Having written off the idea of hired help in the fundraising department, I simply forged ahead, and for the next few years kept focused on simply recording articles and uploading them, all the while involving work-study students, friends, and family. Of all the people that have ever taken part in assistive media, none were more diligent than my mother. She took up the task of photocopying all the magazine articles and standalone book chapters, making sure every page turned out clearly legible and just right. This allowed the stories we were interested in recording to be separated from the magazine or book, and to be organized by subject from which a narrator could choose and take home and prepare for. And the cloth paper allowed narrators to mark up the text with side notes, and to easily read from page to page, and without the noise of a magazine's glossy paper interfering. Following the death of my father, this provided my mother with an activity of purpose requiring a meticulous organization into which she immersed herself for hours on end throughout her late years. When she took a break, she would often sit back and enjoy reading many of the stories she had just photocopied. During this time, I also traveled to Washington, D.C. to attend meetings of the Dept. of Commerce, DOC, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA program, which offered grants for NPO Internet development initiatives. While in D.C., I also had the great pleasure to finally meet two people who profoundly influenced me, the audiobook narrator Grover Gardner, a.k.a. Alexander Adams, and with the help of Tom Lalonde, C-SPAN's founder and CEO, Brian Lamb. I spent a great evening in a bar-restaurant talking for hours with my favorite narrator, and in particular about the Durant Civilization Project, of which he had just finished Volume 12, The Age of Napoleon. And I got a personal tour of C-SPAN from the company founder and host of Book Notes himself. My father would have been pleased. Nothing ever came out of the doc meeting as I was overwhelmed by the colossal red tape process of government grantsmanship and with flashbacks of the fundraising buzzkill. But in D.C., it seems I was perfectly able on my own to meet and would continue to associate with people of a meaningful personal importance to me as opposed to fundraising schmoozing. It was also around this time that author and historian David McCullough found out about my service through my request for permission, and we began a series of short but sincere correspondences over the years. In granting me permission to reproduce several of his shorter writings, he wrote to me, "I want to express my admiration for the work you're doing for the visually impaired." One of the old Scottish philosophers who had a great influence on the founding fathers was Francis Hutcheson, who stressed that the pursuit of happiness involves working for the happiness of others. Your efforts are certainly in that spirit. David McCullough, framed and hanging in my recording studio. In 2004, C-SPAN celebrated its 25th anniversary and invited viewers to send in a short essay as to how and why C-SPAN influenced their involvement in community issues. On the last day that C-SPAN was accepting submissions, I peeled off a gem and hit the submit button. In the essay, I talked about how my late father and I would watch Book Notes together, and that C-SPAN's programming influenced my knowledge of authors, whose long-form magazine writings I often featured on assistive media. Well, sure enough, I got home from work one day, and there was a message on my answering machine. On May 5th, the C-SPAN school bus visited Ann Arbor in honor of my winning essay, one of 25 total, which was the same day as the Visions 2004 event hosted by the Washtenaw Library for the Blind, a biannual event that showcased technology and services for the blind and visually impaired. I was very grateful that in leading up to the bus's scheduled visit, Margaret Wolf gave the okay for the C-SPAN school bus to make an appearance at the event, which was captured and highlighted by C-SPAN and broadcast on their morning show, Washington Journal. This was another great unforeseen happening. With this publicity, I was able to expand Assistive Media's output and secured new space at the Ann Arbor Center for Independent Living. Jim Magyar was the center's CEO, and he was extremely helpful in providing Assistive Media with space that we turned into a public recording studio where anyone could come in to record any of a large variety of magazine articles and short stories to choose from. This collaborative arrangement greatly increased the number of readers that could participate in Assistive Media's mission and resulted in an exponential increase in recorded materials offered. After a few years in the partnership, Assistive Media had over 1,000 recorded long-form magazine articles offered through its website. Hopping on the caravan. In the several years that this was happening, I continued to visit D.C. and meet with Mr. Gardner and Mr. Lamb, and to be disappointed at the DOC NTIA Internet meetings. During a visit to C-SPAN in 2007, and while sitting in the CEO's glass-enclosed office, he gave me the name of a publisher that he thought might be interested in what I was doing. When I contacted Peter Osnos of Public Affairs Books, it was with perfect timing. He was working on his Caravan project, which was, in partnership with about a dozen university-based book publishers, an early demonstration on the many formats that books could be simultaneously offered. He was in need of audiobook production and immediately brought me on board. My involvement in the Caravan project opened me up to the world of university-based publishing and showed me how to handle very strict deadlines. Assistive Media had never really implemented any deadlines. The Caravan project lasted several years, and with its completion in 2010, I wanted to continue to produce audiobooks for university book publishers through my own for-profit venture, upressaudio.com. Despite the number of contacts I made during the Caravan project and having perfected the ability to give reliable and reasonable audiobook production quotes for any printed book based on a word count, I was unable to build a sustainable business due to what was ultimately a lack of any real interest by university publishers in audiobooks. To this day, university-based book publishers are still neglecting the now insanely popular audiobook format. Bringing audiobooks back to life. With the growing popularity of the digital download era of audiobook publishing, another idea came to me when I discovered that the cassette-based audiobooks that were offered for so many years through Books on Tape, BOT, were no longer available, out of print, due to Random House's purchase of the company and its neglect in their converting them to digital audiobooks. Instead of digitizing their cassette-based back catalog, they appeared to be letting it all go. After some more research, I telephoned Duval Hecht, the founder and now retired former CEO of BOT, on the phone and told him of this travesty. I said that BOT's cassette archive of over 10,000 titles could and should be digitized and offered anew. I told him that analog audio digitization was something I knew how to do, and he became very interested about this entirely doable possibility and invited me out to Los Angeles to meet with him and several of BOT's past executives and a potential funder to jumpstart this. During my time in LA, I was able to lay out a clear plan as to how much it would cost, and long it would take to bring back to life the many thousands of dormant BOT audiobook titles. Alas, it was not to be. Random House eventually heard our pitch and simply would not give us the rights to do this, and sadly never saved the out-of-print cassette catalog. But again, the priceless thing in all this was meeting Mr. Hecht, the man who did so much to create the whole of the consumer audiobook industry in the first place, the man who brought to the forefront Grover Gardner Alexander Adams, the man who took time to write me back all those years ago when I was setting off on this very personal and yet far-reaching life pleasure. LifeScienceAudio.com. As I am now past the age of 50, Assistive Media still keeps going as my interests in audiobooks continue to evolve in interesting ways. A few years ago, an opportunity arose that resulted in me working with a medical researcher I knew from my research days, Dr. David Beer. After being out of the lab for 2 decades and reading up on the current areas that were most interesting to me, I was astonished at how much data-driven biology had progressed, and in particular how far DNA sequencing had advanced. After my short stint with Dr. Beer, I was determined to be involved in DNA sequencing. But how? There were no open positions at the UM at that time, and it was very unlikely I would be the first choice for any that were to become open. So I approached the UM's DNA sequencing core lab, and they accepted my offer of helping out as a volunteer. I got in. After 2 weeks of volunteering, the lab's director called me into his office and offered me a permanent paid position, of which I accepted with much appreciation. I got really in. For over 4 years, 2015-2019, I was involved in the DNA sequencing portion of what was the first ever social media-based genomics project, Genes for Good. I also learned the hands-on technique of one of the most promising biological laboratory innovations imaginable, CRISPR/Cas9, a method by which any genome within a cell can be very precisely edited and is destined to become a considerable influence across all of the life sciences in the years and decades to come. This presented an opportunity to me. See www.lifescienceaudio.com.